Hello, geometers, and welcome to Chapter 5. We're going to start Chapter 5 by writing conditional statements, the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So, conditional statements are if-then statements. So, an example of that would be if I study, then I will pass. So if I study, then I will pass. That's what I mean when I say if-then statement. We can use P's and Q's to represent the statements. So if P, then Q. That's how we would read this. If P, then Q. And in this example, P is I study, and Q is I pass. So if P, then Q. The converse, we just flip-flop the Q and the P. So if Q, then P. So in this example here, I would say if I pass, then I studied. Sometimes you have to play around with the tenses of the verbs. It gets a little weird. But if I pass, then I studied. The inverse, we need to negate our statements. So the way we do that with symbols is we put a little squiggly. So if not P, so this we read not P, then not Q. So it's the conditional, except we just negate everything. So that would be if I don't study, right? That's the negation of I study. Then I will not or won't pass. If I don't study, then I won't pass. And then contrapositive is just the converse of the inverse. So we take the inverse and we flip-flop our statements. So if not Q, then not P. So if I don't pass, then I didn't study. So that's just getting used to writing these types of conditional statements. In your packet, if you flip to the next page, we can use these statements when we're writing math-related statements as well. So our symbols here, if P, then Q, right? When we're doing this, we're also going to decide if it's true or false. If it's false, we need to provide a counterexample. So a counterexample is something that proves your statement wrong. So it's like, hey, this is false, and this example here is why it's false. So if two angles are vertical, then they are congruent. That is a fact that we should know. We know that that's true. All right, now let's write the converse of that. So we got to flip-flop it. So if two angles are congruent, then they are vertical. So this is saying if we have two angles that are congruent, 100% of the time, they are going to be vertical. That is a false statement. There's plenty of other angles that are congruent that aren't necessarily vertical. Try to think of an example. One example that came to mind for me is if we have two parallel lines being cut by a transversal, and we have alternate interior angles, so alternate interior angles, those are congruent, but they're not vertical. So that example proves this false. All right, next one. If not P, then not Q. So we just have to negate everything. If two angles are not vertical, then they are not congruent. So if I have two angles that aren't vertical, so they can be some type of other angles, then 100% of the time they're not going to be vertical. We can use the same example. Alternate interior angles are not vertical, but they are congruent. So that's going to be false. I'm just going to use the same counterexample there. And lastly, the contrapositive, if not Q, then not P. So if two angles are not congruent, then they are not vertical. So if I have two angles that aren't congruent, 100% of the time, are they not vertical? Absolutely. If you have two angles that aren't congruent, they can never be vertical. So that one is going to be true. All right, so that's what we're kind of doing in this lesson. Try the other ones on your own, and then when you get back to school, we can check those out.